Test. Thank you. Test. Hi, my name is Tony McElroy, and I'm filling in for Pastor Mark, who is out of town teaching. And I just want to welcome you all in our local congregation and live streamers as we spend the evening with Sondra Baras. First of all, I'd like to open in prayer. Lord, I just thank you that we have a guest today, a special guest. I pray that you bless her ministry. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear what you want us to glean from tonight's presentation. We ask for traveling mercies for her as she flies out tonight, and of course for Pastor Mark and Vicki to come home soon and safe. Amen and amen. It's my pleasure to introduce Sondra Baras. I recognize the name, the books in the bookstore, and emails and online, so to see her in person is really awesome. Her name is Sondra Baras, but her organization is CFOIC, and that stands for Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. They provide a vehicle for Christians to become better informed about Israeli Jewish communities, such as Judea and Samaria is their focus. Now we're broadcasting from Sumner, Washington. That's close to Seattle and Tacoma. So let's give her a good Seattle welcome. Thank you, Sondra.
Well, it's good to be here. It's fun to talk to you guys here and you guys out there, wherever you are, all over the cyberspace, I guess, right? Okay, so first let me just share a little bit about who I am and where I'm from and what I do, you know. I am an Orthodox Jew, and I was raised in Cleveland, Ohio. And 33 years ago, I moved to Israel with my husband, Ed. We then had 2 children, babies. Our oldest was just 2, and our second was 3 months old. We moved to Israel, but we were very interested and very connected to the settlement movement. Going back, for even longer, I was first of all, as a child, when I was like 9 and a half, I think it was, yeah. Exactly 50 years ago, the 6-Day War. Now you know how old I am. The 6-Day War in June of 1967 was a very, very unique and significant time for the Jewish people, for everybody in Israel, and for people all over the world. I think I would mark the very important part of the awakening among Christians all over the world to Israel with the Six-Day War, the 67 war as well. So the weeks before that war, of course, were very difficult and very nervous. Those of you who remember, Nasser was threatening to drive the Jews into the sea, and then all of a sudden you had this stunning victory. The Arabs attacked Israel, but the Israeli army within just a few days was able to turn that all around and suddenly liberate Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel. So I would say that going back to that point, I already had this excitement about Judea and Samaria, and it was just a year or two later, about a year later, that a family friend, their daughter was a college student, and she went to Jerusalem, to Israel, to study for a year at the Hebrew University, and while she was there, they began the settlement of Hebron, and she participated. It's an amazing thing, and so we were hearing about that from her parents, who would hear from her, and then of course my parents were friendly with her parents, and then she met this guy who was also one of the people in Hebron and volunteering there to start the community there, and they got married, and her parents went to Israel. And, and she got married in Jerusalem, but then she lived in Hebron. But what did it mean to live in Hebron in those years? They were living, at the time, the government was still very ambivalent about, yes, settlement, no settlement, do we want Jews in Judea and Samaria or not? And the ambivalence was particularly acute when it came to Hebron, because Hebron, on the one hand, is the oldest Jewish city. You know, Abraham began Jewish settlement in Hebron. And it's a place that has been considered holy to the Jewish people for centuries. We have the tomb of the patriarchs there, where the patriarchs and the matriarchs are buried, the Machpelah cave. And it's a place, though, that not only back from biblical times, and we know that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived there, we know King David established his first capital there, but in modern times as well, throughout the Middle Ages, up until modern times, up until 1929, Jews were living in Hebron. And it was only because the Arabs went on this rampage and massacred Jews in 1929 that the British evacuated the Jews of Hebron at that time. So it wasn't like Hebron, had never seen a Jew or hadn't seen a Jew since King David, but it was actually not that many years that Jews were not living in Hebron. So, so the government, on the one hand, at the time, felt that we need to hold this area of Judea and Samaria, this newly liberated area of Judea and Samaria, and perhaps put it on the bargaining table. And that is where Land for Peace began. This idea that, and at the time, the truth of the matter is I can really understand what was going through the minds of the Israeli government at the time. I don't agree with it. They made a mistake, but I can understand it. Here we had a very new country of Israel, 19 years old. And all of a sudden, they've won this stunning victory after being threatened by all these Arab armies with far superior manpower and weaponry and all that. And that was the situation at the time. And so then to all of a sudden have all that turn around, so I can understand the government of Israel felt, okay, this could be an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. If we can offer something to the Arabs to placate them, then maybe they will be willing to, sign peace treaties with us. And of course that didn't happen. But I can understand where it was coming from. But of course it was a big mistake. So I, at that point, going back to where I was, following all of this, and then on top of that, knowing, even though I was very young, knowing what was going on through this family connection, I just felt like, oh, it's not fair. Hannah is there, and I'm too young. I'm still in school, and, I'm missing all the fun. And that kind of idea of missing the fun of course, I'm joking when I say missing the fun, but, to me, this idea of settling in Judea and Samaria is probably the most important adventure that I could participate in. I think it's probably one of the most important missions that we as the Jewish people have in settling the land of Israel, second only to the original settling of the land of Israel in the early years before and up to the establishment of the state itself. The state of Israel was established in 1948, but the next step of that whole process began in 1967, when the biblical heartland itself was liberated, and we were able to go back and settle in this land, in the old city of Jerusalem, in Hebron, in the areas surrounding Shechem, in the mountains of Ephraim and Manasseh. These are places, these are people, these are areas that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but that were completely off limits to the Jewish people for the 19 years between 1948 and 1967. So when I moved to Israel, we were ready. We just wanted to, step in and see what the opportunities were. And it was actually pretty funny because we landed at Ben Gurion. Well, it wasn't. Yeah, it was Ben Gurion. They called it Lod Airport maybe then. Whatever. We landed at the airport. And in those days, when you made Aliyah, you got a free one-way ticket to Israel, which you still do, by the way. Free. The government of Israel will give you a one-way ticket. Any Jew who wants to make Aliyah, you get a free one-way ticket. We did. We had a free one-way ticket. And then when you get to the airport, you go through a lot of paperwork if you're making Aliyah. You don't go through the regular passport. They whisk you to another room, and you have to do all this paperwork. So when we finished all that, then they give you a free taxi ride to your first destination. And we were going to an absorption center, which was really good because, we really didn't know. We knew a few people in Israel in different places, but, we didn't have family there or anything like that. So it was a perfect place for us to go. And we arrive at this absorption center in Ra'anana. And basically what happens, they get you the free taxi, but the taxi driver takes you there, unloads you and your stuff, and drives off. There we were, 9 boxes, 2 babies, my husband and I don't know when the last time we had slept. I do sleep on planes, but not when you have 2 babies traveling with you. So there we were, and we're okay, now what do we do, you know? And we're about to feel like one of us going. All of a sudden, a friend of mine walks out the door. I hadn't seen her in a while because she had made Aliyah about 6 or 9 months earlier. And there she was. And I said, I didn't know you were here. Oh, she goes, I didn't know you were coming. So she runs inside, gets this cart, brings it out. We're loading up the stuff. She gets us settled. It was great. And then she said, this was on a Wednesday. And she said, you're coming, Shabbat is in 2 days. You know, I didn't even know it was Wednesday. Coming off this, I didn't know where I was, right? She goes, you're coming to us for both meals on Shabbat. I said, yeah, sure. Anything you say, right? So then we got it settled. About 2 hours later, she comes in with bread, milk, cheese, and a list. She goes, look at this list. Okay, a list of family names, about 50, 60 names. And of those 50, 60 families, I knew about half of them from the States, from growing up in Zionist youth movements, summer camp, all that stuff, right? I said, oh my goodness. She goes, this is where we're moving. These are the people we're moving with. Join us. Where is it? Samaria. What's the name of the town? Carnation Road. I said, okay. A month later, we had signed a contract. And the truth of the matter is something we really wanted to do, because when my husband and I arrived, already before, as we were planning on making Aliyah, we were just so excited about this idea of being part of this movement. And so that's how we got there, and we've been there ever since. That was 33 years ago. It took us a while till we built our house, but we've been living in our house more than 30 years now. And we raised 5 children, and I had 3 children in Israel. And 4 of them are married, and I now have 4 grandsons. So life is good, thank God. Okay, so that's me, and that's what I'm doing there. And actually, I run an organization called Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. And when I moved to Israel, that was probably the last thing I ever imagined I would be doing. I was actually an attorney and thought I would just be an attorney for the rest of my life, even though I didn't like being an attorney very much. In Israel, an attorney is called an advocate. And the truth of the matter is I remain an advocate, but I am an advocate for Judea and Samaria. And this is something that was my passion, that I was doing as a volunteer, then started doing it in the context of a Jewish organization, and then just fell into this, met a Christian family who heard what we were doing with Jewish audiences and said, we need the same kind of thing with Christian audiences. And I said, okay, give me the audience, I'll do it. And that's how it began. And it's been wonderful, because Christian Friends of Israeli Communities from the beginning has been a partnership between Christians and Jews who love Israel, between Jews who are living in Israel, not just in Israel, but living in Judea and Samaria, being a part of this amazing pioneering movement to settle the biblical heartland, a partnership between people like me and people like you, Christians from all over the world, from all of the nations, who understand why we're there from a biblical perspective, from a historical perspective, and are supporting and standing alongside us as we face formidable challenges. And those challenges, of course, are coming from 2 places today. They're coming from those same Arab nations that were attacking us in 1948 and attacking us in 1967 and continue to attack us today with certain changes. For example, 2 major Arab nations signed treaties with Israel, Jordan and Egypt. And Jordan especially, that has been a very peaceful relationship, not a warm relationship. Jordan has always been very hesitant in its alliance with Israel, but at least we are not afraid that we are going to be attacked by Jordan. Egypt is has had its ups and downs. We had some difficulties when the Muslim Brotherhood was running Egypt, because they had every intention of doing whatever they could to break the peace, the somewhat fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. Today, we have a much better relationship with the government of Egypt under the General Assisi. He is committed to fighting the crazies, to fighting the radical Islamic terrorists that threaten the stability in Egypt as much as they're threatening stability throughout the Middle East. And so the situation that we see today is actually a very strange one. If you think a bit about it logically, it's very, very unusual. On the one hand, we are surrounded by Arab nations, most of whom are in complete and utter disarray. Civil war, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Iran is a nuclear threat. Saudi Arabia is desperately afraid that Iran will threaten Saudi Arabia. Iran and their nuclear power is a tremendous threat to Saudi Arabia. In the meantime, there's civil war in Yemen, which is at the southern edge of Saudi Arabia. Egypt is in unbelievable turmoil. They have gone through 2 revolutions in the past few years, and right now are under military rule in order to prevent civil war. So none of these countries are exactly stable. And what threatens all of these countries is radical terrorism, radical fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. So why is this an interesting situation? Because for us in Israel, if you look at the map and you look at Israel in the center of the Middle East, surrounded by countries that are incredibly unstable, suffering serious violence, civil war, and radical terrorism, you would think that countries all over the world who were normal, sane, stable democracies would want to support Israel, the one and only democracy in that area, the one and only stable country in that area. And they would see Israel as a vital anchor of peace and stability in the Middle East. And as a way of, the more we strengthen Israel, we can ensure that Israel is not threatened in any way by all these crazies around, and perhaps even from Israel exert a stabilizing influence on what's going on around. Unfortunately, though, what we see is the exact opposite. Because we continue to see countries, Europe, and even here in the United States, particularly under the past president, but also we don't know what's happening today in the United States. Things are big question mark, I think, but certainly under the previous president, Obama, there was a tremendous pressure on Israel. And the exact opposite. Instead of strengthening Israel, while the United States continues to strengthen Israel remarkably from a military point of view, military establishment here in the United States has been very, very supportive of Israel and has been very forthcoming. On the other hand, from a political point of view, and just in terms of who you're standing with and who you're backing, Israel has come under tremendous pressure, and the thrust of this pressure is that we need to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem in order to ensure Middle East stability. Now, when the Sunnis and the Shiites are murdering each other in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Yemen and in Egypt, okay, that has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict whatsoever. There is deep-seated rifts within Muslim society and this propensity for fundamentalist jihad and violence that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. Has nothing to do with any sort of territorial dispute or any other kind of dispute between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the Arab nations. And yet, we see so many of these Western countries continually to push Israel to reach some kind of agreement with the Palestinians, and that agreement is always about a 2-state solution, which means, and I don't want to mince any words here because we need to understand exactly what we're talking about. A two-state solution means Israel withdrawing from all or most of Judea and Samaria, where a Palestinian state will be established. This idea of a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel is absurd. If you think we have bad violence in these countries that I've enumerated, imagine what would happen if suddenly all of these really bad terrorist organizations had a foothold in Judea and Samaria, you know, and with the opportunity not just to kill their fellow Muslims, which of course is great fun, but to kill the greatest infidel of all, the Jewish people. Again, you would think that logic would dictate, in order to prevent that sort of scenario, the Western world would be encouraging Israel to do whatever it could to hold on to Judea and Samaria so that it could be as stable and as strong a country as possible in order to withstand all of this craziness that surrounds it. But as you well know, we're seeing exactly the opposite. We're also seeing new movements from within the Western countries themselves. It's not just a question of what's going on in the Middle East and the extent to which Western governments are supporting or taking positions that I believe are bad for Israel and bad for them. But even within the Western countries themselves, we see a continuing growth of a movement that is very often referred to as BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And this is a movement that, of course, is propelled by Palestinians and their allies. It is funded by both Arab funding and European funding. There has been some wonderful studies done, people who have literally traced the money and have found money that is going from various European governments into organizations that in turn are the leaders of the BDS movement. And what are they saying? They are calling on people to divest from Israel, to boycott any kind of business or academic connections with Israel, and even to impose sanctions on companies who do business with Israel or sanctions on Israel. And what is the crux of what they're saying? I mean, it's kind of an extortion type thing. In other words, I'm going to pressure you, but this is what I want you to do. They are pressuring Israel to withdraw from Judea and Samaria. And that is the supposed reason for this boycott movement is the fact that Israel is settling and building and continuing to develop in Judea and Samaria. So in a way, the issue of Judea and Samaria, the issue of settlements, lies at the heart of so much that is going on in the Middle East and in Israel. If we talk about the violence in the Middle East, that has nothing to do with Israel. But if you talk about the tension between the Palestinians and Israel, if you talk about the pressure that is exerted on Israel, it has everything to do with the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Because this is what has been chosen as the excuse. Otherwise, none of it makes sense. If you are going to pressure Israel and treat Israel, the only stable democracy in the area, and yet you're going to constantly be making demands of Israel, you have to have a reason. And so the reason they've plucked out of the air is the fact that we are settling in Judea and Samaria. And, you know, we can discuss all the reasons, yes, to settle in Judea and Samaria, but I want to focus this evening on the biblical issues involved, because these are the most fundamental. And if you get the biblical issues, then the historical, the political, all that kind of falls into place. So I want to just kind of start with the beginning. We know that Abraham Abraham comes to the land of Israel because God commanded him to. Genesis 12. And the Lord spoke to Abram, go forth. You know what? I'm going to read it one verse just in Hebrew, just so that you hear the Hebrew words. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, lech lecha me'artzecha umimoladecha umibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka. And the Lord spoke to Abram, saying, go forth from your country, from your birthplace, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. And of course he makes wonderful promises to Abraham. And Abraham obeys. And Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram, saying, I will give this land to your children. And he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is the beginning of the story. And that story begins in Samaria. It begins just outside of Shechem on a hilltop called Elon Moreh, the Oak of Moreh. And indeed, one of the first communities to be established in Judea and Samaria was the community of Elon Moreh, which is the Hebrew of the Oak of Moreh. And this was, of course, representing the desire on our part to go back, not just to some nice real estate somewhere in the middle of Israel, but to go back and reestablish a Jewish presence in the very place where God first spoke to Abraham and promised him the land. Now, I know that many of you study the Torah portions, and that's right? Okay. So good. So, in this week, this past week, we read the Torah portion of Ki Tavo. And Ki Tavo, we have the text of the covenant that God commands the Jewish people, the children of Israel, to enter into on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Okay? So, first of all, you have in Deuteronomy 27, it says, and on the day that you will cross the Jordan to the land that the Lord your God gives to you, and you will establish there great stones, and you will cover them with limestone. And you will write upon them all the words of this Torah as you pass. Okay, and in order that when you come into the land that God has promised, the Lord your God has given to you, has promised to you, he's giving you a land flowing of milk and honey, just as he spoke. The Lord your God spoke to your fathers. Okay, and we have then next that they will build there an altar, and then Moses goes on and instructs the nation that they will be divided into two groups, 6 tribes, one group, 6 tribes, the other group. And he says as follows in verse 13, verse 12, and these will stand to bless the nation on Mount Gerizim. And in verse 13, and these will stand on the curse on Mount Ebal. And then we go into what is a very distressing part of the Torah portion, all these curses. There's a short section on blessings, but unfortunately, there's an overwhelming number of verses that are referring to curses. And it's probably a very psychological thing, the idea that maybe, I don't know, that punishment speaks louder than rewards. If you say, if you don't obey, all these terrible things will happen, perhaps that motivates you to be good better than if you do obey, you'll get all these nice things. I don't know. That's just my guess, because it really is an imbalance. You have so much more time spent on the curses. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Now, actually, we have the text of this covenant. This is actually a covenant that is going to be entered into between God and the children of Israel, and it's actually called a covenant at the end of this whole the whole situation. The end of all this text, we have the last verse of Deuteronomy 28. Okay, the last verse says as follows: "And these are the words of the covenant Now, do you know what is the Hebrew word for covenant? Brit, exactly, okay? These are the words of the Brit, these are the words of the covenant, which the Lord has commanded to Moses to enter into this covenant with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant which he executed with them in Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. Okay, the sign. Okay. So basically we have here the text of a second covenant, the first one being Revelation at Sinai, and this is the second one. And we also know that this covenant is stated here in the plains of Moab with Moses, but will actually be executed later on when they actually enter the land of Israel, and they stand between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And in Joshua 8, we have the actual execution of this covenant, okay? And I just want to go back to one more verse to kind of tie this all together. Deuteronomy 11, which we didn't read this week, but this is the introduction to the issue that we have this week. And Deuteronomy 11, verse 29, it starts with verse 26. Verse 26 is as follows: Behold, I place before you today a blessing and a curse. Okay, this is the introduction to this whole ceremony that we have detailed in Kitavo, in the Torah portion of this past week. The blessing, which you will listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today. And a curse, if you do not obey, you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, and you stray from the path which I command you today to follow other gods which you have not known. And it'll come to pass when the Lord your God will bring you to the land that you are going there to inherit, and you will place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Okay, so this basically is the introduction. Then for a bunch of chapters, we go on to other subject matters, and then we come back to it in Deuteronomy 27, which we just read this week. And we continue. So in verse 29, we have the commandment: you come into the land, you're going to place the blessing on Mount Gerizim, the curse on Mount Ebal. And then the next verse, verse 30, tells us where those two mountains are located. So don't forget, Moses is speaking to the children of Israel who have never been to Israel. They were born in the desert, their families or their parents left Egypt, and they're going here for the first time. So it says, they are, again, where is Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal? They are on the other side of the Jordan, in the direction of the setting sun, in other words, west of the Jordan, in the land of the Canaanite who dwells in the Arava, opposite the Gilgal, next to the oaks of Moreh. Now, we met these oak of Moreh only one other time in the Bible, and that's what we just read, Genesis 12. God's commandment to Abraham, where he first tells him that he will give the land to him, his children, Genesis 12. It says, where is it that Abraham heard that message? Where is it that he builds that altar? At the oak of Moreh, which is near Shechem. So essentially, God now is bringing the nation of Israel back to the very place where he spoke the promise to Abraham regarding the destiny of the Jewish people for the first time. The Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal are actually right next to the oak of Moreh, and the city of Shechem is down below. How many of you have been? Have any of you been there? Okay. I actually took a bunch of people from a tour of Pastor Mark, I don't know, what was it, about a year or two ago, there, and we had a wonderful time. Anyway, so tying this all together, basically what we see is that this area, this oak of Moreh, is very critical. It is an area that God first spoke this promise to Abraham, and it is the same area that God brings the nation back where they're going to enter into this covenant with God for the first time in the land of Israel. It's the second covenant. The first one was in Sinai. But the Sinai covenant was executed by Moses, and God actually participated directly in that one because he spoke the commandments directly to the nation. It is a covenant that was made with those people who had just left Egypt, and it was executed in the desert. This covenant, though, is a necessary covenant because it is not that original generation who was around. They've died. We now have the next generation who were not present at Sinai or were children at the time. They themselves they were not enslaved in Egypt. Again, they either were born in the desert or they were children when they left Egypt. Moses is not going to be with them in the land of Israel. So there is a need for a new covenant to kind of cement what had happened at Sinai. But there's also something more significant, and that is rather than having this covenant in the desert, which by definition is a temporary dwelling, is a place of wandering. Now, of course, when that first covenant is made in the Sinai, they don't know that they're going to be hanging out in the desert for 40 years. So it could then have very well been that would have sufficed, being in the desert and then going right into Israel, the same people. But what's so significant about this new covenant is that it is in the land of Israel. And this is the first covenant that is executed between God, the nation of Israel, in the land of Israel. And it takes us back to the promise that God made to Abraham. A promise between God and Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel, in the land of Israel. But at that time, it's a promise. It's not a covenant. It's a promise of what will be. 400 years later, yes, then the children of Israel will come into the land. So this covenant that we have now is really a fulfillment or an execution of this promise that God first made to Abraham. So that it makes it a very, very significant. Now, I was thinking about this. This really, if we're going back to the settlement movement, this is really where we're settling. I find it, I like to stand up there on that mountain, and I very often point out to people, here we are in the very center of the place that the world believes does not belong to the nation of Israel. The very world is saying, you have no business being there. This is Arab land. And yet, this is where the relationship between the nation of Israel and the land of Israel began. This is where Abraham stood, where he was first promised for his children. And this is where the nation of Israel come and execute that first covenant with God in the land of Israel. So I think that's a very, very, important issue to remember. It kind of focuses our attention when we talk about the land. We have to remember we're talking about covenant. And covenant in general, in this context, surely, is a fulfillment of promise. Promise is like a one-directional thing. Promise is God makes a promise to Abraham, and he says, okay. Abraham at that point there's no demand on his part to do anything. It's a one-sided thing. Covenant is a contract. Covenant has two sides. And if you look at the language of the covenant that we just read this past Shabbat, you'll see that it's a two-sided thing where God says, if you obey me, I will bless you. And if you disobey me, I will curse you. Each side has its rights and obligations. Okay? And that's exactly what makes it a covenant. Now, today, of course, is September 11th. And we are remembering today 16 years to that horrific attack here in American soil in the World Trade Center in New York City. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to share tonight, I felt that it would be important. I felt that I had to somehow remember that terrible, terrible thing. And of course, we all know what happened. I don't have to tell any stories. I mean, we know what happened. And the question is, what was the significance of that event? And how do we respond to it today? We all can remember how we responded to it as it was going on. I mean, I was in Israel, of course. And, it was 9 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, and in Israel it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I had just come home, and I just heard this crazy, thing on the news. A plane, looks like a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. Like at that point, nobody knew what was happening. It could have been a pilot error or something like that. And then all of a sudden it became clear that it was a horrible, horrible terrorist attack, and we sat there and we watched the TV. I remember I was glued to the television way past midnight. it wasn't like I needed to see the detail. It's like I needed to get my head around this. I was trying to grasp what had just happened. Now, for me, it was completely different, or for people in Israel in general, it was very different, I think, watching this than it was for people here in America. In America, it was a first. I mean, and it was also, don't forget, this was before there were any serious terrorist attacks on any, on American soil, on European soil. Today, just in this past year, how many terrorist attacks have we read about? Here in the United States, in France, in England, so many, in Germany, so many. It's become, almost ho-hum. I mean, you hate to say that. Terrorist attacks should never be ho-hum. But it's become something that, then it was a complete and total shock. In America, these crazy terrorists, these Islamic fundamentalists from the Middle East would come and attack us and kill thousands of people. But I'm in Israel, and it's 2001, and we have been under attack by Islamic fundamentalist terrorists for a year, for a full year. A full year that every single day we didn't know if there would be an attack. This was between the end of September of 2000 and 9/11, 2001. This was literally an entire year where almost every day, at least several times a week, there were terrorist attacks. Buses were being blown up, restaurants were being blown up, communities were infiltrated. Some things were, thank God, prevented, but so many attacks. And we were dealing not with sophisticated plans like Al-Qaeda pulled off here when they, trained pilots and did all this stuff. These were much less sophisticated, but roaming on our streets. You never knew as you were walking down the street who was going to attack you. And so for us, as we saw 9/11, for us this became clear that, first of all, it's not just against Israel. That there's enemies, that there's evil people that are trying to destroy the values and the lifestyle and whatever we hold dear, both in Israel and in America. And of course, afterwards, that would spread to Europe as well. And I was talking about this with someone today, and she said, take a look at Psalm 83. So I did. 1 second, I got to find it. I usually have a regular Bible with me, but today I have my cell phone. It's not quite as quick, but it's okay. Okay? So Psalm 83, we have a situation of enemies surrounding Israel. Okay? Verse 6, we have that these enemies, what have they done? They have joined their hearts together, and they have executed a treaty. They've entered into a treaty to attack Israel, to come up against Israel. And then we have a whole list of all these different nations that are attacking Israel. We have Edom, Ishmael, Moab, Higrim, Gaval. Some of these we don't know that well. They're not mentioned as much. Bits in the Bible, not so much. Ammon, Amalek, Philistine, Tzur. Tzur is Lebanon, Assyria. Basically, all the nations here, and I think there's a figurative meaning here, because these were not nations that necessarily were powerful and active at the same time. Okay, Assyria and the Philistines did not. They were not at the same time period. Philistines were far earlier. Syria was later. So this is a symbolic way in this psalm to talk about all the nations that have ever come up against Israel and all the nations that have ever surrounded Israel. So it is an expression of this total coalition of the nations coming against Israel. And it mentions also Midian, it mentions Sisera. It like pulls out all the bad guys, and puts them together. Okay? And in this case, we have this idea of entering into a treaty. Now, do you know the Hebrew word for treaty? Brit. In Hebrew, the word for treaty and the word for covenant are the exact same word. Okay? So we just before talked about God's covenant with the people of Israel. Okay? A very important covenant that seals the relationship between them. And sets out, of course, also the do's and don'ts of that relationship. And here, using the same word, the Brit, we have a Brit of the nations who are going up against Israel. And I'm thinking of this in terms of 9/11, and I'm trying to find context, okay? And there's something missing, okay? Because if I look at these two situations put one against each other, I have two types of people. I have the nation of Israel on the one hand, and I have the enemies on the other. And I think today we can very carefully identify who the enemies of Israel are. The enemies of Israel today don't go by the name Ammon, and they don't go by the name Moab, and they don't go by the name Amalek, but they go by the name of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Ahmed and Muhammad and all these other people. And let's put it where it is, the radical Islamic world. These are our enemies, okay? These are nations who have since Israel has been in existence for almost 70 years, we're an independent state, and frankly, it began before that. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in the 1920s was calling upon all good Muslims from all over the world and all Arabs from all over the region to fight and kill Jews. So it didn't wait for the state of Israel to be established. We have had these people as our enemy. But today, I think we see it very clearly that there is a sort of treaty. There is a sort of brit going on around us between all these radical Muslims who are targeting Israel. But then we have characters that we don't read about in Psalm 83. America, Europe, okay? This treaty of nations that are coming against Israel, what did we recognize in why was 9/11 such a critical turning point in all of this? Because it was the point that we can put our finger on, the point at which the treaty of nations, the brit of nations that had been coming against Israel, also came against America and the West. And in a way, I would say even up until that point, until 2001, Israel was under attack. And Israel looked to these very same nations, to America and to Europe, and said, stand with us. And every one of these nations, even as they expressed support for Israel, refused to stand with Israel unequivocally. Give up territory, you're occupiers, you got to placate the Arabs, you've got to give the Palestinians something. Did they really stand with us? Not really. I don't want to, look a gift horse in the face. Yes, we got a great deal of support from America, but when you're talking about standing with Israel, that means shoulder to shoulder and rejecting all of these demands, these ridiculous demands that are being put on Israel. And instead, they waffled. America waffled, and Europe waffled. And then all of a sudden, they're attacked. And there's something in me that says, if I go back to this scripture in Psalm 83 that sets up two sides. Israel, which we know from Deuteronomy, has a covenant, a brit with God. And the nations, the enemies who are coming against Israel, who have a brit among themselves. A brit here and a brit there. And maybe what was going on in 2001, maybe until 2001, God was waiting to see where America and Europe were going to stand. Which brit are they going to enter? And America and Europe said, we're not entering any brit. Or, and this is probably more accurate, we're going to enter all of the brits. We're going to have a brit with this one, and we're going to have a brit with that one, and we're going to see how we can take advantage of relationships with everybody so that we can take home the casino. And what happened? 9/11. And you know what? I was convinced at 9/11 that that would be this wake-up call. That the next morning, and of course, the next morning everybody was crying. Everybody was mourning. Everybody was in shock. So I don't mean the next morning. I mean after the dust settled. I mean after we buried our dead. After the time comes when you have to sit and start to absorb what happened and figure out what to do next. And my anticipation was that they would realize that there are two brits, and you got to choose one. You can't be in breach with two opposing sides. But they didn't choose. And what we are dealing with today, to this day, is the inability of these nations, these wonderful nations. America is a wonderful nation. Europe has the potential to be a wonderful group of nations. These are what we would call the Western civilization that is based on Judeo-Christian values. But to this day, 16 years later, they are really incapable of deciding which brit they're going to be part of. And this is the challenge to us today, you and me, and especially to you. Because you are, for me, it's kind of easy. I'm already in a brit. I have my side. Whether I wanted it or not, I'm born into the Jewish people. I'm an Israeli. We're on one side. We can't be neutral because we're in the middle of it. I think that this places amazing responsibility and opportunity on Christians. Because you, unlike your average Joe in the street in America or Europe, who may see things maybe only from a political point of view, you here in the room, you out there in cyberspace, wherever you are listening to us, you are reading the Bible and you know the word brit, and you have read Psalm 83 and you understand that we have to make a choice. And you know what? Sometimes when our governments fail to make the choices, we as individuals can make those choices. Now, none of us here in the room, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, nobody here is a prime minister or a president of a country. If you are, see me afterwards, we'll do a deal. We'll make a treaty. But I do believe that individuals can take responsibility. We can't change the world. We can't change our government's policy, although we can try to influence our government's policy. So sending emails and calling and doing all that kind of stuff is always a good thing. But there are things that we can do in our sphere as private citizens to indicate that we know which treaty we're supposed to be with, which brit we're supposed to align ourselves with. And I think that really, if I have to say, what is Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is all about, it's that. It's enabling Christians to bind with the Jews and to join our brit. I mean, in the broadest sense possible. It's not the same brit, but to stand with us in our brit with God And what is the Brit all about? What did God promise to Abraham? And what is this Brit? Go back and read what you just read in the Torah portion this week. What are all the punishments and the rewards all about? The land. If you're good, the land will flourish, and you will be happy in the land, and there will be peace in the land. And if you are punished, there will be destruction in the land and famine in the land, and enemies will come into the land, and you will be exiled from the land. The land is key. And the land does not just mean dirt. It's far more than even when a farmer is very, very attached to his land because he sees that his sustenance comes from the land. He plants the land and he waits to reap from the land. That is a very important relationship, but this is far deeper than that. Because in this context, the land represents the relationship between God of Israel and the people of Israel. The land binds us. And in that sense, if I just extrapolate that a bit further, and we talk about you as the nations joining us in this Brit, the land becomes something you can focus on, something you can attach yourselves to as you're joining this Brit. If you're standing with the land of Israel, if you're supporting and strengthening the people who live in the land of Israel, then you're standing on the right side of the Brit. And that's really what Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is all about, because what we've done is we've reached out to people like you from all over the world, and we've given you the opportunity first to learn about who we are. Why are we living in Judea and Samaria? Why? Well, because that's the land God gave us. That's where it all happened. That's where God promised the land to Abraham. That's where the covenant took place between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. That's in the heart of Samaria. Hebron, where our forefathers and foremothers are buried. The first capital of King David. All these places, go look in the Hebrew scriptures, read story after story after story. Almost all of it took place in Judea and Samaria. That's why we're there, because it's the heart of our land, and God gave us to us, opened that amazing window of opportunity for us through that victory in the 6-Day War, a war that we didn't ask to fight, that we were attacked. That's the meaning. That is why we're there. But it is the key to it all. Because if you deny the right of the Jewish people to live in Judea and Samaria, you're denying the biblical foundation of the relationship between the land of Israel and the Jewish people. And the next step is to deny the Brit between the God of Israel and the Jewish people. And he himself tied up with the land. And he tied it up in Samaria, in that part of the land. So it's all interconnected. And I believe that the events that we're seeing as terrorism grows, as the threats against Israel and the United States and Europe grows every single day, month, year, God is just speaking louder and louder, that's all, until somebody notices. But I think you've all noticed, and I think you all hear. And I think it will make an enormous difference. The more you stand with us and people you know stand with us, come to Israel, visit with us, and then become our ambassadors. Share this message, share this word with anyone you know who is willing to hear. And eventually, we will become a multitude that can affect public opinion, and I believe on a spiritual level, a multitude that cries out to God to protect Israel and to secure the nation of Israel in the entire land of Israel. And there's nothing more helpful to the situation today than that multitude that will be crying out to God in that way. So I'm turning to you and asking you to join me in that. Amen is right. Okay. I would like to give some time for questions and answers, for sure. But I also want to first just take a few minutes to tell you a bit more about the organization of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, and we have a film that will tell you more about that as well. As I mentioned, it began as a vehicle to advocate for Judea and Samaria and to educate Christians. So that you would have a better understanding of why we're there and why it is so important from a biblical perspective, not only for Jews to be there, but for you as Christians, as Bible-believing Christians, to support our right to be there. But we have also been involved in a very practical way in helping the communities and strengthening them. One of the things we're doing is tour groups who come to Israel from all over the world contact us, and we arrange wonderful tour programs in Judea and Samaria where you can come in, you can meet people, you can see for yourselves the biblical sites, and then come into the communities which we have built in recent years, and you can understand the miracle that is taking place before our very eyes today in Judea and Samaria, in the land of Israel. And we're also giving Christians the opportunity to get involved in a practical way by providing financial support to so many vital projects and programs that we are part of in Judea and Samaria. And these programs can be emergency and security equipment, they can be children's needs, they can be needy families, senior citizens, they can just be all kinds of things to beautify and strengthen the communities themselves. And I want to show you now a film that will give you a better understanding of how that works and of some of the things that we have been accomplishing in recent years. So, if we could see the film.
You know, as an American Christian, Genesis 12:3 says that we as Christians are to bless God's chosen people. Genesis 12:3 says, I will bless those who bless my people, and I will curse those who curse my people. And I've always wanted to be a part of that blessing. But living in America, in the heartland of America, it's been so hard to try to figure out a way that we could be a part of what's going on in Israel. Until one day we came across Sondra Baras working with Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. In driving through Judea and Samaria with her, seeing the work that she's doing in the communities there, we learned that we too could be a part of what's going on there. We saw schools that didn't have playgrounds. We saw senior citizen centers that needed more help. We saw all kinds of things. We saw clinics that needed equipment, and we saw security fences that needed to be completed. I would like for you to come with me now and just walk through a few of these communities in Judea and Samaria and see the work of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities.
A major focus of CFOIC Heartland in recent years is a variety of special education programs throughout Judea and Samaria. These same pioneers who sought to follow God's word and settle the land are also uniquely sensitive to the needs of others, and especially of the weakest members of society. One example is Heart of Benjamin, located in the community of Ofra.
Levav was born with Down syndrome and integrated very well into the schools, into the community here. As she got older and the gap between her and her classmates grew, more and more there were demands on her that made her, that put her under more pressure than she needed. And then I heard about Lev Benjamin, the Heart of Benjamin. I took her there the next day, and 2 days a week ever since she's been going in the afternoons. A great community of kids. She's got friends there. She's free there. She enjoys it immensely. If she doesn't want to get out of bed in the morning, we say, this is a Heart of Benjamin day. She jumps.
Heart of Benjamin is this amazing place for her. She feels comfortable there, she's relaxed, she gets amazing attention. She's a very social, active human being, and she really gets a lot of those needs met there. I think there's no place in the world like Heart of Benjamin for her.
CFOIC, which supports an organization like this, is really making it possible for something like this to happen.
CFOIC Heartland has also supported the Sadna program in Gvaot, a special needs school that is now at the center of a new village in Judea, a community with a special needs child at its heart. CFOIC Heartland has become a place where people with a variety of needs can turn and receive help, and especially when tragedy strikes.
I called Sondra and told her that we were in need for a family who were orphaned, 5 children moving in with the older sister. It was before the high holidays. Within 2 days, Sondra made sure that the money would arrive into Choa so that they would be able to buy everything that they needed for the holidays. I can't express how grateful we are for the amount of times that Christian Friends of Israeli Communities come through.
Security has always been a central need in Judea and Samaria. So many families were touched and hurt by terrorism. So many people are vulnerable and need protection.
12 years ago, my son Kobe Mandel and his friend Yosef Ishran, 2 8th graders, walked out to this canyon right here to explore the place where their friends had been playing in for 20 years. Sometime around 10 o'clock in the morning, they were trapped in a small cave by 4 or 5 Palestinian terrorists and beaten to death with boulders the size of bowling balls. When we found out, my wife fell to the ground and said, "How are we going to get through this?" And we said, "We're going to get through this because we have 3 other children." Even as we live the dream the Jews have been dreaming for 2,000 years, to live in the land of Israel, the land of our forefathers, we have to be constantly wary and conscious of the fact of the safety of our children. It's a constant battle to keep them safe in this land that God promised to us, the Jewish people.
CFOIC Heartland has been there for so many communities as they seek assistance in protecting their residents.
Here in Neve Tzuf, we have a very large problem with Arab arson on all different sides of our community. The equipment that CFOIC has purchased for us has made our firefighting capabilities much better and made our firefighters much safer.
In addition to firefighting needs, CFOIC Heartland has provided life-saving medical equipment for Neve Tzuf.
We have the automatic external defibrillator that was purchased. We have an oxygen balloon. We have an ambo bag. We have a cardio pump. We have suction. We hope never to have to use this equipment, but we know that here in the largest building that we have in our community, this equipment is ready for us to use at any time to save a life.
We're wedged between the eastern border of Israel with Jordan, and to the west, the Palestinian Authority. And we can't afford to take the issue of security lightly. Every one of our communities has a rapid response team, a group of young men who are all volunteers who train in order to be able to be the first responders in any issue, in any case. One of the major threats we have from the Arab population is a thievery and robbery of our produce and of our animals. If they're able to come in to steal, we don't know what the next step will be, but we're afraid that it might be something much more severe. CFOIC is so much a part of enabling us to live here. We've gotten support, we've gotten help in equipment, and we've also had help in education and social needs within the communities, within the region. CFOIC Heartland is such an important part in protecting the people in the communities of the Jordan Valley.
The Adumim block consists of 3 communities, Alon, Nofe Prat, and Kfar Adumim. We lived here for 20 years, and 15 years ago, after the murder of our friend Chagit Zavitsky, a year later, we established this pioneer community, and we lived there for 2 years all alone. And this CFOIC has been connected to us since then. They've been helping us for the past 20 years with all our special needs, if it's security, if it's emergency equipment, if it's youth programs, and even a petting zoo to help us work with our special needs children. We're very appreciative to the CFOIC for being there for us for all these years.
Now that you have seen what we do in Israel, I hope that you will take this opportunity to join us in the work and being a part of the fulfillment of prophecy. You can do this by making your contributions to Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. And in doing that, you will be a part of the blessing that God promised to us in Genesis 12:3. Those who bless my people, I will bless. Every penny that you give, every dollar that you give goes to help our friends in Judea and Samaria. And we really hope that you will join us today in this effort, because it's our heart, and I know it's your heart too. Come join us.
So this is, does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Are there any Palestinians living in Judea and Syria? And if there are, how is that working?
There are a lot of Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria. There's probably about at least 2 million. Yeah, a lot. And there are about 450,000 Jews. Well, we live in separate places. First of all, a good part of Judea and Samaria has been transferred to the Palestinian Authority. That began in 93 and went through 99, a series of land transfers. Okay. So we have parts that are completely under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, parts that are shared authority, and in those places there are no Jews. And then there's Area C, which is the areas that are remain in the exclusive control of Israel, and that's where all the 450,000 Jews live, plus an additional, I don't know, probably about 100,000 Arabs live in Area C. So there is a certain division that has already happened, but the Israelis retain overall control over the area, which is why we're safe. Are relatively safe.
But it sounds like the division is quite lopsided in the favor of the Palestinians.
Well, I think that actually there's still a majority of the land that's under exclusive control of Israel. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the map, and I encourage those people who are, watching this live stream. No? What am I doing? Oh, okay. Those of you live streaming, you could go to our website, cfoic.com, and see this map. And this will show you exactly where the various areas are. The brown areas are areas A, that is exclusive control of the Palestinian Authority. The solid yellow is jointly controlled Palestinian and Israeli, and that's where all the Arabs live. The rest of the area, the background area here, which is like a beigey whatever color, that's Area C, and that's where the Israeli communities are located. So, but keep in mind that the overall area is still under overall IDF control. And yeah, but there's a jigsaw puzzle is really what you're seeing. And if people think they're going to be able to create two states out of this jigsaw puzzle, then they're dreaming.
With President Trump now and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, what's the general, or is there any general consensus as to whether or not, like the presence of Kushner, is that going to help the Israelis in any way, or is he just another one of the rest of them?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. When President Trump was elected, there was a great deal of enthusiasm in Israel. There was no love lost between the Israeli people or the Israeli government and Obama. And Trump had made some amazing statements during the campaign, one of which that he was going to immediately move the embassy, the American embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He then said that he was going to, on his first international trip, he was going to come to Israel, which he did do, and that visit was amazing. The warmth that he exuded towards Israel and the Jewish people, the fact that he went to the Western Wall, he prayed. There was one little quirk in that he refused to allow Prime Minister Netanyahu to accompany him to the Kotel. But there were some very, very good things that happened in that visit. But since then, there's been a lot that we question. Of course, he continues to stall on this issue of moving the embassy, and it's almost moved completely to the back burner, which is very, very unfortunate. And there's been so much personnel change in the White House, as I'm sure you all know, that we're not sure who's doing what and what the attitudes are. Now, Jared Kushner is a good Jew, and I'm sure he loves Israel. I'm not familiar. I don't think anyone is really familiar with what his actual recommendations are and what his policies would be with regard to a two-state solution. He's just never been in politics. He's never been in a position where he would have stated his opinion on these issues. So we really don't know. I mean, we know he loves Israel and the Jewish people. He is Jewish and an Orthodox Jew, so he's very committed, but we don't know what he feels. I can tell you right now that when Trump said that Jared Kushner was going to get a deal, I don't know if Trump believed he was going to get a deal, but there's no question he will not get a deal. It just won't happen.
And so when you're saying that he's not going to get a deal, that makes me think that he probably wants a two-state solution. Is that where you're leaning?
I have no idea, because you see, Trump has made so many contradictory statements. He said, on the one hand, that there's no reason why Jews shouldn't be allowed to build throughout Judea and Samaria, and so we applauded. And then he said, well, and then he also said, I'm not going to impose an agreement, and whatever agreement, two-state solution, one-state solution, whatever you want, as long as the Israelis and the Palestinians agree. But then he started making statements about, no, the direction of the government is a two-state solution. So, and then you have people like Masterson and Tillerson, who are not particularly pro-Israel as far as we can see, who are gaining influence in the White House. So right now, it's a huge question mark. We just don't know. I am hoping and praying that Trump will end up fulfilling the promises and will continue the direction that he seemed to indicate he was going to follow during the campaign and immediately after being elected. But right now, there's no way I think any of us can know or say what he's going to do. It's quite and it is a time, by the way, for people like you to write to the White House and to make your voices heard. Do not pressure Israel. Israel has the right to build everywhere in Judea and Samaria, and the two-state solution is dead. It's time to look for other solutions. Those are your 3 points. You have to keep writing them and saying them over and over again, and get as many people as you know to write and say these things as well. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And if you just join me in a quick prayer, we'll close. Lord, I just thank you for Sondra and her heart for Israel. Lord, change the hearts. I pray that millions of people around the world, that this goes viral and that those hearts turn toward you and your people. Thank you, Lord, for all these people coming, for traveling mercies, and those live streaming for their faith. Amen and amen.